I pulled into my gravel drive, expecting the usual smell of ponderosa pine and the kind of heavy, mountain silence that's been my only real neighbor for the last decade. But instead, I found the front end of a disaster in progress. There they were, three guys who looked like they'd just raided the generic contractor aisle of a thrift store, standing in front of my detached garage with a look of frantic, misguided purpose that only a HOA-mandated ego can produce. I was in Oppos. Gone more than 40 minutes, just a quick run down to the local hardware spot for some conduit and a decent cup of coffee. And yet in that window of time, these geniuses decided my property was no longer my own. One guy, the leader I assume, was wearing a hard hat so shiny it had clearly never seen a day of actual work, and he was wedging a crowbar into the seam of my garage door like he was searching for buried treasure, while his buddy stood there with a clipboard and a neon vest that still had the fold lines from the packaging. The third guy, younger and twitchier, was holding a phone up, recording the whole thing with a sort of shaky, nervous energy as if he knew deep down this was a terrible idea, but was too afraid of the boss to stop. I didn't oppose to even honk. I just let my truck idle there for a second, watching the absurdity of it all play out through the windshield, feeling that familiar, cold calm that used to settle over me back in my days of federal service. You see, before I moved out here to the high country of Wyoming to build my own servers and live off the sun, I spent 12 years in a world where, unauthorized entry, usually involved much higher stakes and much more competent criminals. I slipped the truck in a park, stepped out onto the gravel, and just leaned against the door, watching them realize the owner was home. The guy with the crowbar froze, his face going a pale shade of, I and Oppos am about to be sued, while the clipboard guy tried to stand up straighter, puffing out his chest in that way middle managers do when they're about to quote a handbook they don into Oppos to actually understand. I didn't in Oppos. TL, I didn't in Oppos. T-scream. I just looked at them and asked if they were here for the garage door repair or if this was some new kind of aggressive door-to-door sales pitch. But the clipboard guy, whose name I later found out was Miller, cleared his throat and said this was a, mandatory safety inspection, under the Cedar Ridge HOA emergency bylaws. Now, here's the kicker. My property ISN in Oppos. To even in Cedar Ridge, it borders it, but a few years back they tried to annex my 10 acres because they wanted my access road for a new development, and I told them, in no uncertain terms, to kick rocks. So when Miller started talking about, hazardous materials, unlicensed electrical infrastructure, being a threat to the community, I knew exactly who sent them. This had the fingerprints of Diane Vancroft all over it. The HOA president who treated the neighborhood like her own personal feudal kingdom and who had been eyeing my land like a hungry hawk for years. Miller tried to push past me, saying they had the right to secure the site if I wooed and Oppos. T comply. And that's when the guy with the crowbar made the mistake of shifting his grip and stepping toward me with the tool raised just a little too high. It happened fast, the kind of muscle memory that never really leaves you regardless of how much time you spend behind a computer screen. And before he could even register a thought, I had his wrist locked, the crowbar clattering onto the stones, and him face down in the dirt. The other two panicked, Miller tripping over his own boots as he tried to scramble back toward their car. And the kid with the phone just stood there, jaw dropped, still recording as I zip-tied the leader in Oppos. S-hand with the heavy-duty ties I keep in my truck's emergency kit. It was quiet then, just the sound of the wind through the pines and the heavy breathing of three men who had vastly underestimated who they were dealing with. I sat down on my tailgate, dialed the county sheriff, and waited while Miller started whimpering about, legal repercussions, and, Diane and Oppos, as authority, to which I just replied that Diane and Oppos, as authority, ended exactly 60 feet behind them at the property line marker they'd walked right past. When Sheriff Colton arrived, he didn't end Oppos. To even look surprised, he just tipped his hat, looked at the guys on the ground, and asked me if I'd given them a chance to leave, and I told him I'd given them the same chance I'd give anyone breaking into a high-security facility. None. We ended up in court a few months later for a civil suit, and it was a total bloodbath for the HOA, especially when Melinda, my attorney who's as sharp as a razor and twice as cold, played the high-definition drone footage I had of the entire incident. My security system is triggered by motion, and it had captured everything from the moment they stepped over the fence line, including the audio of Miller saying, and quote, Diane said, just find something, anything, that looks illegal so we can get the injunction, end quote. The judge, a no-nonsense woman who had clearly dealt with Diane's antics before, handed down a judgment of $120,000 in punitive damages and issued a permanent restraining order against any HOA board member stepping within a mile of my gate. You'd think that would be the end of it, right? Most people would take the hint, pay the fine, and find someone else to bother, but Diane ISN into oppose. Most people. She's the kind of person who views a legal defeat as a personal insult that needs to be scrubbed away with fire. And over the next 6 months, my life turned into a slow-burn, psychological thriller. It started with the end quote, concerned citizen end quote, reports. First, it was the EPA showing up because of an anonymous tip about, end quote, chemical runoff, end quote, into the local creek. Then it was the fire marshal because of, end quote, unshielded lithium arrays, end quote. And every single time, I'd walk the inspectors through my immaculate, over-engineered setup, and every time, they'd leave scratching their heads, apologizing for wasting my time. But then it got darker, and the flyers started appearing in the mailboxes of every house in the 5-mile radius, featuring blurry, zoomed-in night photos of my workshop with captions asking if neighbors knew about the, end quote, clandestine data farm, end quote, or the, end quote, unlicensed radio towers, end quote, that were supposedly causing migraines and killing pets. I started seeing a dark SUV parked on the shoulder of the road late at night, just sitting there with its lights off, and I knew she was trying to bait me into doing something stupid, something she could use to get the sheriff back out there. But what Diane didn't into oppose, know, what she couldn't into oppose, possibly have grasped at her world of garden committees and fine collection notices, is that my, end quote, data farm, end quote, I send and oppose, just for hobby work. I spend my days doing deep dive forensic analysis for private firms, and when you start poking a bear that knows how to track every digital footprint you've ever left, you're not just asking for trouble, you're inviting an avalanche. I noticed my network started taking hits, thousands of pings a second, a classic distributed denial of service attack meant to knock my servers offline, and when I traced the origin of the botnet, it didn't in oppose, lead to some hacker group in Eastern Europe. It led back to a series of residential IP addresses right in Cedar Ridge, including Diane's own home. She'd actually hired someone, or perhaps her college-age son who thought he was a tech wizard, to try and crash my system. And that was the moment the game changed from a property dispute to a federal felony. See, once you start using hijacked devices to attack a network that handles sensitive, encrypted data for government contractors, which I do, you've officially stepped into the jurisdiction of people who don and oppose. Care about your HOA bylaws. I spent a week gathering the logs, mapping the packet headers, and building a case that was so airtight it could hold vacuum. And then I made one phone call to an old friend in the Bureau Cyber Division. 2 days later, I was sitting on my porch, drinking a beer, and watching the sunrise when a fleet of black Suburbans rolled past my gate and headed straight for the Vancroft residence. It wasn't an oppose, just a knock on the door. It was a full-scale forensic sweep, and as I watched them carry out boxes of hardware and Diane's son being let out in handcuffs, I felt a strange sense of exhaustion rather than joy. The fallout was spectacular. It turned out Diane had been using HOA funds to pay for the, end quote, consultants, end quote, who were running the smear campaign and the cyber attacks. And the audit that followed revealed she'd embezzled nearly $200,000 over the last 5 years to fund her lifestyle and her son's legal troubles. The neighborhood turned on her in a heartbeat. The same people who had been whispering about my, end quote, secret lab, end quote, were suddenly at my gate with gift baskets and apologies, realizing they'd been led by a sociopath who was stealing their dues to fight a personal war. Diane ended up taking a plea deal to avoid a 10-year stretch, and she's now living in a tiny apartment 2 states over, stripped of her house, her reputation, and her power, while her son is doing 3 years in a federal facility for unauthorized access to a protected computer. I still live out here. The garage is finished, the servers are humming quietly, and the silence is finally back to being a companion rather than a held breath. Every now and then, I'll see a new HOA board member driving by, and they don and oppose, To even slow down, they just keep their eyes on the road and keep moving. It's a funny thing about power. People think it's about who has the loudest voice or the fanciest title, but out here where the wind bites and the land doesn't and oppos, T care about your rules. Power is just the ability to be left the hell alone. I didn't oppose. T want a war. I just wanted to build my things in the quiet. But if you come onto a man and oppos, land with a crowbar and a lie, you'd better be prepared for the fact that some people have spent their whole lives learning exactly how to push back. It makes you wonder, though, how many other, in quote, Dianes, in quote, are out there right now, weaponizing a little bit of local authority to ruin someone's peace, and whether the people under them are ever going to wake up and realize that the person claiming to protect the community is actually the one destroying it from the inside out. What do you think? Is there ever a point where a community's, in quote, safety, in quote, justifies stepping over a neighbor's line, or is the HOA just a playground for people who never outgrew the need to be the schoolyard bully? Drop a comment below. I'm curious to see where you draw the line between being a good neighbor and being a target.